There is a quality that we admire in certain people, a kind of self-assurance that draws us to them. They move through the world with certainty, with clarity of purpose, with an ability to face challenges without collapsing into doubt or fear. We call this confidence. But there is another quality that appears similar on the surface, yet produces a very different effect. It is a kind of grandiosity, a self-importance that alienates rather than attracts, that creates distance rather than connection. We might call this ego inflation. And the difficulty is that from the outside, and sometimes even from the inside, these two states can look remarkably similar. Both the confident person and the inflated person may speak with conviction. Both may take bold action. Both may appear to have overcome self-doubt. And yet there is a fundamental difference between them, a difference that becomes apparent when we look not at the surface behavior, but at the underlying psychological structure. The confident person is grounded in reality, in genuine self-knowledge, in an accurate assessment of their capacities and limitations. The inflated person is living in a fantasy, in an identification with something larger than the human ego can actually contain, in a disconnection from their actual nature. The paradox is this: true confidence requires humility, while inflation is built on the denial of limitation. The confident person knows what they can do because they also know what they cannot do. The inflated person believes they can do anything because they have lost touch with the reality of who they are. And this loss of touch, this inflation of the ego, is not strength but weakness, not health but pathology, not genuine development but a kind of psychological possession. When we speak of ego inflation in depth psychology, we are describing a state in which the ego has identified with contents that belong not to the personal psyche but to the collective unconscious. The ego, which should be the center of consciousness and the mediator between the inner and outer worlds, has instead become possessed by archetypal energies that are too large for it to contain. It has confused itself with something transpersonal, something universal, something that properly belongs to the realm of the gods or the archetypal patterns rather than to the individual human being. This inflation can take many forms. There is the inflation of the person who believes they have a special mission, that they are chosen or destined for greatness, that ordinary rules and limitations do not apply to them. There is the inflation of the spiritual seeker who identifies with enlightenment, who believes they have transcended the ego when in fact the ego has simply expanded to cosmic proportions. There is the inflation of the intellectual who believes their understanding is complete, who has mistaken knowledge for wisdom and cleverness for genuine insight. There is the inflation of the successful person who believes their achievements make them fundamentally superior to others, who has confused external success with internal worth. In all these cases, what has happened is that the ego has crossed a boundary. It has taken something that belongs to the self, to the totality of the psyche, and has claimed it as its own possession. It is identified with an archetype, with a universal pattern, and in doing so has lost its connection to the human, the limited, the finite. The person experiencing this inflation feels powerful, special, beyond the ordinary. But this feeling is based on a fundamental confusion, a category error in which the ego believes itself to be something it is not. Now, let us contrast this with genuine confidence. Confidence arises from a different source entirely. It comes not from identification with the archetypal, not from inflation of the ego, but from a grounded sense of one's actual capacities, developed through experience and tested against reality. The confident person has tried things, has succeeded and failed, has learned their strengths and their weaknesses, has developed competence in certain domains while acknowledging incompetence in others. Their confidence is specific, bounded, realistic. The confident person knows, for instance, that they are good at a particular skill because they have practiced it, have received feedback, have seen the results of their efforts. They can speak with authority in their area of competence because they have earned that authority through experience. But they do not extend this confidence beyond its legitimate domain. They do not assume that because they are competent in one area, they are competent in all areas. They maintain a clear boundary between what they know and what they do not know, between what they can do and what they cannot do. This groundedness in reality is what distinguishes confidence from inflation. The confident person's self-assessment is based on actual evidence, on repeated testing against the world, on honest self-observation. The inflated person's self-assessment is based on fantasy, on identification with an ideal image, on the denial of contrary evidence. The confident person can say, "I know I can do this because I have done it before, and I understand how to do it." The inflated person says, "I know I can do this because I am special, because I am different, because the ordinary limitations that apply to others do not apply to me." Let me give you a concrete example. Consider a young therapist who has recently completed their training. If they have genuine confidence, they approach their first clients with a realistic sense of their abilities. They know they have learned certain techniques, they have studied theory, they have practiced under supervision, they can work competently within the scope of their training. But they also know there is much they do not yet know, many situations they have not yet encountered, much experience they still need to gain. They are willing to consult with supervisors, to refer cases that are beyond their competence, to acknowledge when they do not know something. Now consider the same young therapist in a state of inflation. They have finished their training and have identified with the archetype of the healer, the wise one, the one who can save others. They believe they have special insight, special powers, that they can handle any case that comes to them. They do not seek supervision because they believe they already know what they need to know. They do not acknowledge limitations because they have identified with the unlimited. They may speak with great authority, may present themselves with great certainty, but this certainty is not grounded in reality. It is grounded in inflation, in the ego's identification with something it cannot actually contain. The difference becomes apparent when these two therapists encounter difficulty. The confident therapist who meets a case they cannot help will acknowledge this, will seek consultation, will refer the client to someone more experienced. Their confidence is not threatened by the acknowledgement of limitation, because their confidence was never based on the fantasy of unlimited competence. The inflated therapist, when they encounter failure, when they realize they cannot help a client, experiences this as a narcissistic wound, as a threat to their entire self-concept. They may deny the failure, may blame the client, may rationalize or become defensive, because to acknowledge limitation would be to puncture the inflation, to lose the identification with the archetype. This brings us to a crucial point. Inflation is unstable. It cannot be maintained indefinitely because it is based on a falsehood, on a disconnection from reality. The inflated person must continually defend against evidence that contradicts their inflated self-image. They must avoid situations that might expose their limitations. They must surround themselves with people who reinforce the inflation rather than challenge it. They must construct an increasingly elaborate fantasy to maintain the identification with the archetypal. And eventually, this structure collapses. The inflation cannot be sustained. Reality intrudes. Failure occurs. The person is confronted with their actual limitations in a way that can no longer be denied or rationalized away. And when the inflation collapses, the ego often swings to the opposite extreme. The person who believed themselves to be extraordinary now believes themselves to be worthless. The one who identified with the God now experiences themselves as utterly inadequate. This is what we call enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposite when they are pushed too far in one direction. Genuine confidence, by contrast, is stable because it is based on reality. The confident person does not collapse when they encounter limitation or failure because they never believe themselves to be unlimited in the first place. They can learn from failure, can adjust their self-assessment, can continue to develop without experiencing each setback as a fundamental threat to their identity. Their confidence may be shaken by particularly difficult experiences, but it does not collapse entirely because it was never based on inflation in the first place. Now, we must ask, how does inflation occur? What are the psychological conditions that lead the ego to identify with archetypal contents? There are several common pathways. The first is compensation for deep feelings of inadequacy or inferiority. The person who feels fundamentally inadequate, who carries shame about their worthlessness, may unconsciously create an inflated self-image as a defense against these unbearable feelings. The inflation serves to cover over the underlying wound, to protect the ego from having to feel the pain of inadequacy. This is why inflation and inferiority are often two sides of the same coin. The person who presents with grandiosity, who speaks of their special abilities and their unique destiny, is often defending against a deeply felt sense of being fundamentally flawed or worthless. The inflation is a compensation, a defense mechanism, a way of not having to face the shadow of inadequacy. And this is why, when the inflation collapses, the person swings to the experience of complete worthlessness. They were defending against that experience all along. A second pathway to inflation is the experience of genuine contact with archetypal contents in a way that the ego is not prepared to handle. This can occur in spiritual experiences, in moments of creative inspiration, in encounters with the numinous. The person has an experience that transcends the ordinary ego, that touches something universal and profound. And instead of recognizing this as an experience of something beyond the ego, they identify with it. They confuse the messenger with the message. They believe that they themselves are enlightened, are a genius, are chosen, when in fact they have simply had contact with something archetypal. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. To have an experience of the self, of the archetype of wholeness, is not the same as being the self. To receive creative inspiration from the unconscious is not the same as being the source of that creativity. To touch something divine is not the same as being divine. But the ego, especially if it is not well grounded, can easily make this mistake. It can identify with the experience rather than recognizing itself as the vehicle or the witness of the experience. A third pathway to inflation is the projection onto oneself of the idealized image, what we might call the identification with the persona or with the ideal self. The person constructs an image of who they should be, an ideal that is often based on cultural values, family expectations, or archetypal patterns. And instead of recognizing this as an image, an aspiration, they believe they have already achieved it. They identify with the ideal and deny all aspects of themselves that do not conform to this ideal. This is particularly common in individuals who have been praised for certain qualities or who have been given special treatment because of talents or achievements. The child who is told they are gifted, that they are special, that they are destined for greatness, may come to identify with this projected ideal. They internalize the image of themselves as exceptional and construct their ego around this identification. But because it is an identification with an image rather than a grounded sense of actual capacities, it is inherently inflated. It is not based on reality, but on a fantasy of who one is supposed to be. Now, let us speak about the shadow in relation to inflation and confidence. The inflated person has typically split off and denied the shadow, the aspects of themselves that do not conform to the inflated self-image. They cannot acknowledge weakness, failure, limitation, ordinariness, because these contradict the identification with the extraordinary. And so these qualities are repressed, denied, projected onto others. The inflated person sees weakness in others and despises it, not recognizing that they are encountering their own denied vulnerability. This denial of the shadow is what makes inflation so problematic. The person is not whole. They are living in only one half of their psyche, the inflated, grandiose half, while the other half, the humble, limited human half, remains unconscious. And the unconscious shadow does not simply sit quietly. It acts autonomously, sabotaging the person's efforts, creating symptoms, manifesting in projections and relationship difficulties. The confident person, by contrast, has integrated more of the shadow. They have acknowledged their limitations, their failures, their weaknesses. They have faced the ways in which they are ordinary, imperfect, human. And, paradoxically, this acknowledgement of the shadow is what makes genuine confidence possible. Because when you have faced your limitations and integrated them, you are no longer defending against them. You can be realistic about what you can and cannot do. You can acknowledge failure without it destroying you. You can be humble without being self-effacing. This is the integration that inflation lacks. The inflated person is fragmented, split between the conscious identification with greatness and the unconscious reality of being human. The confident person is more whole, more integrated, more capable of holding both their strengths and their weaknesses in consciousness without needing to deny either. Let me speak now about the role of the archetypal in relation to these two states. Archetypes are universal patterns, inherited structures in the collective unconscious that shape human experience and give rise to typical motifs in myth, religion, and culture. They are not personal. They do not belong to the individual ego. They are transpersonal forces that operate through individuals, but are not reducible to individual psychology. When a person is in a state of inflation, they have typically identified with an archetype. They believe they are the hero, the savior, the genius, the enlightened one. They have taken a universal pattern and claimed it as their personal identity. This is a category error, a fundamental confusion between the personal and the archetypal. The ego, which is finite and limited, has identified with something infinite and unlimited. And this identification is dangerous because the ego cannot actually contain archetypal energies. It is not built for that purpose. The result is that the person becomes possessed by the archetype rather than being in conscious relationship with it. The archetype operates through them in an unconscious and often destructive way. The person who identifies with the hero may engage in grandiose and reckless behavior, may take on challenges they cannot actually handle, may sacrifice themselves or others in pursuit of an impossible ideal. The person who identifies with the savior may develop a messiah complex, may believe they alone can rescue others, may become controlling and invasive under the guise of helping. Genuine confidence, by contrast, does not require identification with an archetype. The confident person can draw on archetypal energies when appropriate without identifying with them. They can embody the hero in moments that call for courage without believing they are the hero. They can access the energy of the sage when wisdom is needed without identifying as the sage. They maintain the distinction between the ego and the archetype, between the personal and the transpersonal. This is a mature relationship to the archetypal. It involves recognizing that archetypal energies can work through us, can inspire and guide us, but that we are not identical with them. We are human beings who can participate in archetypal patterns, who can be touched by archetypal forces, but who remain fundamentally human, limited, finite. This recognition prevents inflation while still allowing access to the power and meaning that archetypes provide. Now we must address the question of how one develops genuine confidence without falling into inflation. This is a delicate matter because the process of developing confidence requires that we challenge ourselves, that we take risks, that we attempt things we are not certain we can accomplish. But how do we do this without tipping into grandiosity, without inflating beyond our actual capacities? The key lies in maintaining contact with reality, with actual feedback from the world. Genuine confidence is built through a cycle of attempt, feedback, learning, and integration. You try something. You observe what happens. You learn from the results, both successes and failures. You adjust your understanding of your capacities based on this feedback. You try again with this new understanding. Over time, through this iterative process, you develop an accurate sense of what you can and cannot do. This process requires honesty, the willingness to see reality as it is rather than as you wish it to be. It requires the ability to acknowledge failure and learn from it rather than denying it or rationalizing it away. It requires the capacity to receive critical feedback without experiencing it as a fundamental attack on your worth. It requires distinguishing between your performance in a specific situation and your value as a human being. The inflated person cannot engage in this process because they cannot tolerate the feedback that contradicts their inflated self-image. They interpret failure as an attack, as evidence of others' inadequacy or malice, as a meaningless anomaly. They cannot learn from reality because they are not in contact with reality. They are living in their fantasy of who they are, and any evidence that contradicts this fantasy must be rejected or distorted. Another essential element in developing confidence without inflation is the practice of humility. But we must be careful about what we mean by humility. Humility is not self-abasement. It is not the denial of one's actual capacities or the refusal to acknowledge one's strengths. Humility is the accurate perception of oneself in relation to reality. It is knowing both what you can do and what you cannot do. It is acknowledging your strengths without exaggerating them and acknowledging your limitations without being crushed by them. This kind of humility is compatible with confidence. Indeed, it is essential to genuine confidence. The humble person can be confident in their areas of competence because they are not making inflated claims. They are simply acknowledging what is actually true. They can say, without arrogance, I am good at this, because they can also say, without shame, I am not good at that. The balance, the realism, the groundedness. This is what creates stable confidence. Let me also speak about the role of the self, the archetype of wholeness, in relation to confidence and inflation. The self is the center and totality of the psyche, the unity that encompasses both conscious and unconscious. It is the goal of individuation, the process of becoming whole. And the relationship between the ego and the self is crucial for understanding the difference between confidence and inflation. In a healthy psyche, the ego is in service to the self. The ego is the conscious center, but it recognizes something larger than itself, something that it serves and to which it is accountable. This relationship keeps the ego in proper proportion. It prevents the ego from inflating beyond its actual size and function. The ego that knows it is not the totality, that recognizes the self as the greater wholeness, maintains a proper humility. But when the ego identifies with the self, when it confuses itself with the totality, inflation occurs. The ego begins to believe it is the center of everything, that it is whole and complete in itself, that it does not need to be in relationship with anything larger. This is a fundamental error, a kind of psychological hubris that invariably leads to problems. The person with genuine confidence maintains the ego-self axis, the connection between the conscious ego and the larger self. They know they are not the totality. They know there are forces in the psyche larger than the ego, depths they do not fully understand, aspects of themselves that remain unconscious. This knowledge keeps them grounded, keeps them open to continued growth and development, prevents the ego from inflating beyond its proper bounds. Now I want to address the particular danger of spiritual inflation, because this is a form that can be especially subtle and especially destructive. Spiritual inflation occurs when a person who has had genuine spiritual experiences identifies with those experiences in a way that inflates the ego rather than transcending it. The person mistakes a genuine encounter with the transpersonal for a personal achievement or a personal identity. This can happen to anyone engaged in spiritual practice, but it is particularly common among those who have had powerful experiences of expanded consciousness, of unity, of transcendence. These experiences are real. They do touch something beyond the ordinary ego. But the mistake is in the interpretation. Instead of recognizing these experiences as gifts, as glimpses of a reality beyond the personal, the person claims them as evidence of their own spiritual advancement. They identify as enlightened, as awakened, as spiritually superior to those who have not had such experiences. The irony is that genuine spiritual development involves the relativization of the ego, the recognition that the ego is not the center, is not the most important thing, is in service to something larger. But spiritual inflation is the opposite of this. It is the ego claiming spiritual experiences as its own achievement and using them to reinforce its sense of specialness and superiority. The ego has not been transcended. It has simply incorporated the spiritual into its inflated self-image. True spiritual maturity involves what we might call grounded transcendence. It involves having experiences of the transpersonal while maintaining connection to the human, the limited, the ordinary. It involves being touched by the divine while remaining fully human. It involves the integration of spiritual insight with psychological realism, with shadow work, with the acknowledgement of one's own darkness and limitation. The spiritually mature person does not claim to be enlightened. They do not present themselves as having transcended the ego or as being fundamentally different from others. They remain humble, grounded, aware of their ongoing struggles and limitations. They may have access to genuine wisdom, may have experienced profound states of consciousness, but they do not identify with these experiences. They recognize themselves as vehicles through which something larger works, not as the source of that something. As we move toward the conclusion of this reflection, I want to speak about the therapeutic implications of understanding the difference between confidence and inflation. When we work with individuals in analysis or therapy, we often encounter both of these states, and it is crucial to distinguish between them and to work with them differently. The person who presents with inflation needs to be brought back into contact with reality, with their actual limitations, with their shadow. This is delicate work because the inflation is often defending against deep wounds, against feelings of inadequacy or worthlessness that the person cannot bear to face. Simply puncturing the inflation without addressing the underlying wound can lead to collapse, to depression, to the swing into the opposite extreme, of feeling completely worthless. The work involves gradually helping the person to see the inflation, to recognize the ways in which their self-image is disconnected from reality. It involves creating a safe enough relationship that they can begin to acknowledge limitations without experiencing total collapse. It involves working with the shadow, bringing into consciousness the denied aspects of themselves. It involves helping them to find a more realistic and grounded sense of themselves that can include both strength and weakness, both competence and limitation. The person who lacks confidence, who struggles with feelings of inadequacy, needs different work. They need support in taking risks, in testing themselves against reality, in discovering their actual capacities. They need help in distinguishing between realistic self-assessment and harsh self-criticism. They need encouragement to acknowledge their strengths without immediately dismissing or minimizing them. They need to develop the capacity to receive positive feedback without deflecting it. But there is a danger here as well. The therapeutic relationship can itself become a place of inflation if the therapist is not careful. The patient may idealize the therapist, may project onto them the archetype of the wise one or the healer. And if the therapist identifies with this projection, if they begin to believe they really are the all-knowing healer, they fall into inflation themselves. The therapist must be able to hold the archetypal energy without identifying with it, must recognize it as projection while still working with it therapeutically. This is true in all relationships, not just the therapeutic relationship. We are constantly encountering archetypal projections in our interactions with others. Someone may see us as the hero, the enemy, the lover, the authority, and we must be careful not to identify with these projections, not to believe that we are the archetype that is being projected onto us. We can recognize the projection, can understand its meaning and its source, can work with it if appropriate, but we must not confuse it with our actual identity. Let me conclude with some reflections on how we might navigate the tension between healthy aspiration and dangerous inflation in our own lives. It is natural and appropriate to aspire to growth, to want to develop our capacities, to seek to become more than we currently are. The problem is not with aspiration itself, but with the identification with the ideal before it has been actualized, with claiming to be something we have not yet become. The path of genuine development involves holding the tension between what we are and what we might become. We need the vision of what is possible, the ideal toward which we are working. But we also need the grounded awareness of where we actually are, what we have actually achieved, what we are actually capable of at this moment. The tension between these two, the ideal and the actual, is what drives growth. But if we collapse this tension by identifying with the ideal, we fall into inflation. If we collapse it by abandoning the ideal, we fall into stagnation. The practice, then, is to maintain the tension, to aspire without claiming to have arrived, to work toward greater competence without pretending to be already competent, to be inspired by archetypal visions without identifying with the archetypes, to remain grounded in reality while reaching toward possibility. This is the middle way between inflation and its opposite, between grandiosity and self-diminishment. And this brings us back to genuine confidence. Confidence is not about claiming to be more than you are. It is about knowing accurately what you are. It is about being grounded in reality while remaining open to growth. It is about integrating shadow and light, strength and limitation, success and failure into a coherent and realistic sense of self. It is about maintaining the proper relationship between ego and self, between the personal and the archetypal. If this exploration has illuminated something in your own experience, if you recognize the patterns of inflation or the struggle to develop genuine confidence in your own life, I invite you to support this channel by liking this video and subscribing to Psyche and Meaning. This work exists for those who are willing to examine themselves honestly, who seek to understand the subtle dynamics of the psyche, who are engaged in the difficult work of becoming whole rather than simply appearing successful. Your engagement helps this content reach others who are ready for this depth of inquiry. And so, we return to the question with which we began. What distinguishes confidence from inflation? Confidence is grounded in reality, in genuine self-knowledge, in the integration of shadow and light. Inflation is grounded in fantasy, in identification with the archetypal, in the denial of limitation. Confidence is stable because it is based on truth. Inflation is unstable because it is based on falsehood. Confidence allows for continued growth because it includes the acknowledgement of what one does not yet know or cannot yet do. Inflation prevents growth because it requires the denial of limitation and the rejection of feedback that contradicts the inflated self-image. The invitation is to examine yourself honestly, to notice where you might be inflated, where you might be claiming to be more than you actually are, where you might be identified with an archetype or an ideal rather than grounded in your actual capacities. But also to notice where you might be denying your genuine strengths, where you might be refusing to acknowledge what you actually can do, where false humility or fear might be preventing you from developing legitimate confidence. The work of becoming whole requires both. It requires the deflation of inflation, the return to reality, the integration of the shadow, but it also requires the development of genuine confidence, the realistic acknowledgement of capacity, the willingness to claim your actual strengths without exaggeration or apology. It requires the difficult and ongoing practice of seeing yourself clearly, of maintaining the connection to reality while remaining open to growth, of being neither more nor less than you actually are. This is the path of individuation. This is the work of a lifetime.